unify, which is pretty much the central argument of the entire book of 1 Corinthians, although each of these different topics has its own relation to it. But anyway, the first week we talked about unity. Second week we talked about being wise, and then third week we talked about being mature, and then last week we talked about being pure. We talked about it in a specifically in a context of sexual purity, but purity encompasses my entire life. It's not just my sexuality that purity refers to. My thought life and my actions, my desires, all those things need to be pure also. But we did frame the argument this way. We said that there are two guiding principles for biblical purity as it comes to sexuality. Number one, if it takes place before or outside of a marriage relationship, regardless of what it is wrong. Okay? If it takes place before or outside the marriage relationship, it's wrong. And number two, if it violates biblical principles of purity, such as edification, building each other up, love, kindness, gentleness, and design, aka one man, one woman, it is also wrong. And these two principles can guide pretty much everything falls under that umbrella for purity. And we also said this. We said that sexual sin is never an isolated sin, which is why it's so hard to get it out of your heart, because it usually comes with something else. There's usually anger or frustration or envy or bitterness or something in there that's kind of masking it, or that's the platform for it. And so that's why it's so hard to get it out. You can't just stop lusting because there's something else that's kind of driving that. Then we said that sexual sin defiles the whole body. It's not just like this one little area of your life that you can kind of keep compartmentalized. It's going to affect every aspect of who you are if you don't do something about it. Job says that it's a fire that will wipe out everything that I own. And then we said that sexual sin is possible to overcome. We talked about fleeing. We talked about setting up guidelines and things of that nature. And so that's where we left it last week. So we're going to add something else to our list tonight, and that is to be content. To be content. So we are in 1 Corinthians 7, and we're going to be talking about marriage tonight. Marriage. So contentment, again, can encompass a lot of different areas of life. But tonight we're actually going to talk about contentment in relationships. Contentment in relationships. So let me just give you a 50,000 foot flyby, bird's eye view of some of the things that Paul talks about here. So there are three types of relationships that are, I shouldn't say relationships, three types of walks of life that Paul references in chapter 7. And they are people who are celibate, people who are married, and people who are single. Okay, so he kind of groups these into three different categories and talks about different things there. And we talk about people who are celibate. Remind me and remind the room of one of the big issues of what's going on in the city of Corinth. What's one of their big sins? It's what we've been talking about. What's one of their big sins? Who are they worshiping, by the way, in Corinth? Who?
I was just saying
immorality. Yeah. So what do you remember the name of the goddess they're worshiping in the
goddess of love?
The goddess of love, Aphrodite. So they're Aphrodite's the greatest, and she says that we should have sex all the time, and that's how we're going to worship her. So that's going on in Corinth, and it is infiltrating the church. And there's people that are not doing stuff about it, which is why Paul calls them arrogant in the previous chapter that we looked at last week. He says you're arrogant, you think you're okay, you're not doing anything about this guy who's doing all this terrible stuff. But there was also a group of the Corinthian believers who are practicing what's called celibacy. And basically, this group of believers, they're setting themselves against the immorality in the city and in the church. So they're advocating celibacy and declaring that this is the state that all Christians should conform to. Okay. So if you don't know what celibacy means, that means that you never have sex or any type with anyone, anytime, anywhere. And so they're saying every Christian should be abstinent. No Christian should engage in sex, and that includes married couples. That's what they're saying. So married couples should not have sex with each other. They should never engage in sex. That's what the problem is. So they're saying this, and Paul's going to address that. He's going to promote celibacy, but he's also going to say, listen, it's good for husbands and wives to engage in sexual activity with one another, and that's a good thing. It's honorable. It's good for the marriage. But he's also going to say that celibacy is a good thing for those who have been called to practice it. Okay, so we'll look at that in a minute. But he's going to talk about marriage, okay? And so when we talk about marriage, this is the one that's being redefined by the Supreme Court, or they're attempting to redefine what marriage is. But we would say that marriage is the permanent union of a man and a woman, depicting God's relationship with His people. And we were talking about this, some of the guys and I, in our small group earlier. about the fact that that's the issue that really, for me, undermines the whole gay marriage is okay with the Bible argument, is that marriage is supposed to be a picture of Christ in the church, okay? And it doesn't work in a homosexual relationship. That picture is marred in that picture, so in that relationship, excuse me. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But so God's intention for humanity from creation is to have the family unit, which is based on a man and a woman in marriage with one another. And so what Paul is going to do here, and this is a passage that people point to and say Paul's against marriage because he talks about how people should be celibate like he is, and he says that marriage is just to prevent people from sinning sexually and that kind of stuff. He does say specifically in this chapter that people who are struggling with lust should get married because it's a way to not sin in that way by remaining single. But what he's saying is specifically in the instance of the Corinthian believers is that this is an issue in your culture. It's a good thing for you guys to have husbands and wives so that there's not an extra temptation there. So it's a very specific thing that he's saying here. And he's not laying the groundwork for marriage as though the only reason you should get married is so you don't have lustful problems. That's not a good foundation for a marriage. To say, I don't want to sin sexually, so how about I marry you? Okay, that's not what he's saying, and that's not what he's promoting. And we'll look at another passage also that he talks about for marriage. And then the third group of people that Paul addresses are those who are single, and this includes people like you guys who are young, who have not found a spouse. It also includes widows, and it also includes people who have been divorced. Okay, widows or widowers. And Paul's general advice, spoiler alert, to these people is that those who are in the state should not desire to get married. Okay, should not desire to get married. We'll add a caveat to that. In other words, those of you who are not married should be content and devoted to God, not toward finding a spouse. All right. He does say some things, and we can, by cross-referencing with Scripture, we can see that widows and widowers are free to remarry, and remarriage after divorce is possible. But it gets tricky. It's permissible in certain circumstances. And so just to kind of, we're not going to talk a lot about that tonight. It's too nuanced of a conversation to just make a blanket statement about it, about what's true and what's not. But I do believe that the scriptures say that the goal should always be reconciliation. So it's really difficult to reconcile with a spouse that you're separated from if you're married to somebody else. So I think that the goal is usually for reconciliation, but again, it's a very individual, and God gives grace in that, I believe. So singleness is preferable for people who are in this situation. And so because marriage is for life, it's a union that what God has brought together, let no man tear asunder. It shouldn't be entered lightly. I think it's only right that it should be hard to remarry. Like it maybe like some of you are thinking like, well, it's not fair for somebody who's divorced, they can never get remarried. I don't know. I think that depends on their heart and the situation that went on. But I think it should be hard. I think it should be hard to recommit yourself to somebody else after your previous marriage didn't work out. So my 2 cents. We'll not necessarily dive into that side of the conversation tonight, but we can. If you guys have questions about that, we can definitely dialogue about it. So here's where I want to go tonight. We're going to have 3 principles for contentment in our relationships, and number 1 is to be devoted to God's commands rather than man's opinions. All right, so look with me at chapter 7. We're going to jump around a lot in this passage tonight. We're not going to read the whole chapter. So jump with me to verse 17 of chapter 7. If you're not there, we're in 1 Corinthians 7. If you don't have a Bible, look over the shoulder of the person next to you. So verse 17 says, "Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God." And then verse 20 says, for each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. So we want to be devoted to God's commands rather than man's opinions, or, God's commands rather than tradition or any of that sort of thing. We want to be devoted to God's commands. So again, the Corinthian believers, they're dividing into groups. They're breaking up. Without being unified, again, the whole theme of 1 Corinthians. So there's 3 groups that we can kind of generally lump them into. Group A, who said celibacy. Everybody should be celibate, okay? Group 2, those who are in favor of tradition. We can still have traditional marriage and all that kind of stuff. And then there's the third group of those who are just actively practicing sexual immorality and not caring about it. So those are the general breakdowns. And can you guys see like how that can cause so many different divisions and people that their relationships can't be together anymore because they have a fundamental disagreement on what each other is doing. Now, so Paul makes a couple of specific references to the fact that this is a command from God, and this is something that I'm saying. Like he'll say, like in verse 10, to the married I give this charge, not I but the Lord. And then in verse 12 he says, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. That he's throwing his own opinion in there. That doesn't make it any less scriptural because he's still using the wisdom that the Spirit has given him. And like people who argue about whether or not the Bible can be believed will say things like, well, Paul said his own opinion there, so that verse is not scriptural, and this verse isn't. You can't make that division because he's speaking and writing through the wisdom of the Spirit. But Paul inserts his own wisdom in here because however the relationship between him and the Spirit worked when he was writing, like the Holy Spirit didn't say write this about this, and so however that worked. But anyway. His stance is that the practice of celibacy does have merit, and he practices it himself. Look over at let me find it. Didn't write the reference down. Where is it? Oh no, I lost it. He says, I wish everyone were to be as I. Oh, here we go, verse 6. It says, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, and one of one kind, and one of another. And then later on, he talks about the benefits of being single versus the challenges of being married. So he's saying that there's merit to this practice of not getting married. And he thinks it's a good idea, but he's not forcing anybody to do it the way the other believers in the Corinthian church are doing. They're like, you have to do this or you're sinning. Paul's not saying that. He's saying it's a good idea, but it's not for everybody. But I want to make this point very clear, though. The idea of celibacy, the idea of like purity, is necessary for every single Christian until you get married. Okay, you guys with me on that? Like there should be no sexual activity. Remember our first guideline that we established last week was that if it takes place before or outside of marriage, it's wrong. So celibacy, the idea of celibacy, abstaining from sex, is a good thing, and all Christians should practice that who are not married. Okay. However, not everybody is called to live that life. Not everybody is going to be happy without a spouse their entire life. You understand what I'm saying? So, like, if you find a spouse, Paul is saying it's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea. He does say that there are challenges to it, but it's not wrong for you to do that. You guys with me on that? Cool. Okay. So here's the thing. Our world and our friends have a lot of opinions. Okay, so we're saying we're being devoted to God's commands and not man's opinions. Our friends in the world have a lot of things to say about marriage and sexuality and things like that. So here's a list of some things that the world says, or maybe some of your friends have said this to you. One, marriage is unnecessary. It's not necessary. What matters is my commitment to the person, and so we can have a marital kind of relationship without like going through the ceremony, and that's okay, right? This is a statistic. The number of cohabitating couples in our culture has nearly quadrupled over the last 30 years. Fewer than half of all American households today are made up of married couples. Fewer than half of all American households are made up of married couples today. Because marriage as an institution in our world's eyes is not necessary. We can live together with all the same amenities of marriage and be married for all intents and purposes, but not actually go through with the ceremony. They also say that feelings should determine commitment. And I think, this is something we're all aware of, right? Like Disney says you should follow your heart all the time, just listen to whatever the tree says to you and that kind of stuff. But feelings determine commitment. In other words, emotions should be the basis of the decision. Emotions should be the basis of the decision. I don't think that the world gets love wrong. I think the world gets love backwards. Because the world says that my feelings, how I feel about a person, should determine what I do, with them. It's not that I don't have a commitment to the person, it's that I should feel like having a commitment to the person. Does that make sense? So it's not that it's wrong, it's backwards. It is wrong because it's backwards, but you understand what I'm saying? And so, as Christians, we believe that, especially in a marriage, like my commitment to my wife, my commitment to Tara does not change because on one day I don't feel like it. You know what I mean? Like my feelings don't determine the commitment. The commitment should be what determines my feelings. And then we also say this. We have this idea that nobody should be alone. Like nobody deserves to live a life by themselves. So, not long after the IQ, or the intelligence quotient test, was developed, several studies were conducted to find out how different groups of people would score on the test as groups. So, statistics being in action here, okay? The test was administered to men and women, young and old, rich and poor, and many ethnic groups as well. It was in this context that the IQ test was given to a group of Hopi Indians, okay? When the Hopi received the test, they immediately started to ask each other questions and to compare their answers. The instructor saw this happening and quickly intervened, telling them that they each had to take the test on their own. You're not permitted to help each other or to share your answers amongst yourselves, he told them. When the Hopi heard this, they were outraged and refused to take the test, saying, it's only important what we can do together. Now, I tell that story because I think it's true. On one hand, God created us to live in community with one another. That includes friendships, and it includes marriage and family relationships also. We aren't meant to be alone. So there's a bit of truth to this statement, okay? Christianity is not a religion for lone rangers, right? We need each other. We need to be in fellowship and encouragement and all that kind of stuff. However, when it comes to our romantic relationships, how do I say this? Romantic relationships are not the measure of our self-worth. Okay? I don't need to be in a relationship with somebody to determine whether or not I can worship God. I don't need to be in a relationship with somebody to determine, whether I have value in my life. Like, as an individual, I can worship God and I can serve. You understand what I'm saying? The romantic relationships and companionship and all that stuff that the world values so highly, it's good stuff. It's good stuff. It's not wrong for you to want to be with somebody, but that's not the measure of your self-worth, and it's not the measure of how well you're living your life that you have a spouse or a significant other. You understand what I'm saying? And furthermore, we talk about nobody being alone. We're never alone because God is with us. Because God is with us. Okay. Even though perhaps you feel lonely because you don't have a significant other, or because there's brokenness in your family relationship or whatever, God is with you. Nobody has to walk this world alone. Nobody has to walk this world alone. Okay. So that's what the world says. That's some of the things that the world says about marriage, about feelings, about love. This is what God says about marriage. Some of the things. Marriage is a good thing. Marriage was specifically designed, and marriage has a sacred purpose. And I'm going to throw a couple of verses up here. From the mouth of Solomon, the pen of Solomon, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. Not only is the relationship a good thing, but the Lord blesses a godly marriage, a marriage that's founded upon love for God also. This is Jesus, and he's actually quoting from Genesis here. So the Pharisees, they come and they're like, how can we still practice divorce? Can we not practice divorce? All this kind of stuff. They're just asking questions to trip him up. Verse 4, he answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. God designed it from the beginning with this purpose, that they should become one. They should remain together. It's a functional design, and it's an intentional design. It's supposed to work the way that God designed it. And then this is Paul speaking in Ephesians about marriage, and I condensed it a little bit. I know it's a wall of text, but this is so important. He says, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy, without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. Therefore a man," and this is the same passage from Genesis again, it must be important. "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. The institution of marriage, as God designed it, is to be a picture of the love that Christ has for us. And in the way that Christ gave himself for us, husbands are supposed to emulate that by giving themselves, for their wives. And wives are supposed to show that kind of loving, humble, yielding to their husbands leading. It's not some kind of domineering, like woman is inferior and man must rule. Like men, it's not none of the kind of stuff that our culture would say. That's what patriarchal, nuclear family kind of stuff looks like. It's not that at all. It's a sacred purpose that God designed, and it functions when it is done correctly. It functions when it's done correctly. Marriage is a good thing. It's specifically designed. It has a sacred purpose. And that's what God says about it. So we need to be devoted to God's commands and God's truths rather than what our world's opinions and our friends' opinions have to say. So we're being devoted, and we're going to go through these last two quickly. We're going to leave the future to God. We're going to leave the future to God. And I find that in verse 26. Look with me at chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, verse 26. So Paul says, "I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Don't seek to have a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman married, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away. And I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord and how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about the worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. The unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and in spirit, but the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord." Here's the deal, okay? Wherever you are, whether you're thinking, one day I want to get married, or whether you're thinking, I never want to get married, I don't want to deal with any of that, there's merit to both opinions. But either way, regardless of what we want to happen, we have to leave the future to God. To leave the future to God. And I find this principle even more clearly in the book of James, where James says, come those who say, today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a town and spend a year there, trade, make a profit. You do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. James highlights the idea that it's okay to make plans. That's great. Please make plans. Don't just live your life willy-nilly and never think about what tomorrow holds. But don't think that this is what God has in store for me and this is what's going to happen. Because God has different plans than us most of the time. He's got different plans than us. You don't know what the future will hold. God does. So we need to be wise in our preparations, but not obstinate. We can be determined, but we don't want to be bullheaded. Okay? So one day at a circus, the clowns were putting on a particularly good show. One of them was a little guy who was wearing an extremely tall hat. Very comical. While he was bowing elaborately to a dignified woman, his hat fell off, and an elephant sat on it. The clown gestured wildly at the elephant, but the beast sat still. He waved and shouted again and again, but the elephant never budged. Angrily, the clown stepped behind the elephant and kicked with all his strength and hopped away with a sore foot in his hands. Then, frantic with anger, the little clown turned back to the elephant and tried to lift him off the hat. Defeated and in complete despair, the clown sat down and started to eat peanuts. The elephant was interested in peanuts and got up, ambled over, and begged for some. All right. A lot of times when we have an idea about what the future is supposed to be like, whether we're thinking long-term or tomorrow, I think we're a little bit like a clown kicking the elephant. It's not wrong to desperately want something. It's not wrong to have plans. It's not wrong to have ambitions. But we need to strive first and foremost to please God and not ourselves. And we can't we can't make our ambition something about this world, right? He says that the present form of this world is passing away. We should live as though we're unmarried. We should live as though we're rejoicing in something that's yet to come. Our ambition as Christians should be to glorify God, not to get what we want in life. Whether you want to get married, whether you want to stay single, like, you can't make your goal of the future into this territorial, kind of idol where you ignore the possibility of what God might want to shape you through. Okay? You don't know what the future holds, so, regardless of where you stand on this, you're too young to be thinking about marriage anyway, those of you who are, so, anyway. Leave the future to God. Don't be so obsessed with that. And last point, guys. Remember that my goal is heaven. And we kind of made this point already, but look with me one more time at verse 31. He says, those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, or that you should be like that. For the present form of this world is passing away. Is passing away. My goal is not to get married. My goal is not to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, whoever you are. We have a tendency to treat singleness like all it's about, like where you guys are right now, as like preparation for getting married. I don't think that's the way we should think about that. I think, this is from the Counterculture by David Platt. He says, a man or a woman's aim is to find a mate who completes him or her. In this view, marriage is an end in itself, and sexual consummation is a celebration of such completion. Yet the Bible teaches that God created marriage not as an end, but a means to an end. God created marriage not as an end, but as a means to an end. So what if instead of like living right now, you guys weren't just thinking about, the job that you're going to have and the spouse that you're going to have and the kids you're going to have and that kind of stuff. What if you maximize this time to devote yourself fully to God, to give Him your heart as well as your hands in whatever service He might call you to do, and just trust that He's got a perfect plan, and don't try so hard to peg in what your life has got in store for you, because again, God's plan is different than ours. He wants our holiness, not our happiness. He wants our holiness, not our happiness. And that doesn't mean that God wants you to be a miserable, lonely person who, just lives in an abbey somewhere and just prays all the time and smacks yourself in the head with the Bible, okay? He wants you to be holy, not happy. And holiness brings a kind of satisfaction and a kind of joy that the happiness of this world cannot begin to compare to. When you are devoted to God, there's a satisfaction. There's this great verse that people misquote all the time, where I think it's in Psalms or Proverbs. It says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and the Lord will delight to give you the desires of your heart." People are like, "Oh, all I got to do is worship God, and then I get like my Ferrari." No, it works. If I delight myself in the Lord, then all I want are more things of the Lord, right? If I genuinely delight myself in Him, He will give me the desires of my heart, and at that point, the desire of my heart will be more of Him, and more of worship of Him. So God's plan is different than ours. He wants our holiness, not our happiness. And my life is not ultimately about my relationships. All right? Your dating life, or your lack thereof, is not the top priority. Your dating life or your lack thereof is not the measure of your self-worth. Let me take you back to little Justin's high school dating life. Okay? Little Justin's high school dating life was kind of like a sitting in the corner with a binder writing really melodramatic song lyrics, because Justin felt sorry for himself that he wasn't dating anybody, right? And so little Justin back in high school spent all that time doing that, feeling sorry for himself, and ended up in college making a whole bunch of really dumb choices when it came to relationships, because what mattered to me was evaluating who I was based on who I was with. Don't be like little Justin in high school, okay? You can sit in the corner and write song lyrics if you want, but don't think that because you're not dating someone, or because you are, that's what determines who you are, and that determines what you value. You guys with me on that? I'm not saying don't date if your parents are okay with you dating. That's great, but be aware that there's a temptation there. There's a number of temptations there, but there's a temptation there to begin to base all of your life on that other person. And when you're in high school, it's not a good thing to do. It's not a good thing to do. You don't know what God has in store for you in the future. All right? So that's where we're going to leave it tonight, guys. We want to be devoted to God's commands. We want to leave the future to Him. And we want to remember that our goal is heaven. It's not any kind of relationship here. It's not any kind of job here. It's not anything here. If we want to practice the kind of contentment that can bring unity in our hearts and with one another, this is the way we've got to frame our purposes. So, is there any questions on that? All right, I'm going to pray. Once again, I'm going to hang out up here. If you guys have any questions or anything you want to talk about, I'll be here. But then after that, you guys are free to go. So let's pray.